Hello, this is Annie, and today I want to talk about what you do when you find an image on glass, how you figure out what it is exactly. There's only actually a few things it could be, or a few categories of things, so we'll learn a little bit about what each of those is, and it should be able to help you identify any glass image thing you find. Before we get started, I'll just apologize again because I still have a cold and any related coughing, sniffling, etc. I apologize for in advance. And now, glass photo thingies. So, the first thing to know is that there are basically three categories of photographic type images on glass that you'll find. There are some that are negatives, like this. There are some that are prints, like this. And there are some that are slides, like this. So, in general, a negative is a thing that you use in the darkroom and shoot light through it onto some sensitized paper, usually, to create a photograph. Usually, paper prints like we're accustomed to. And glass negatives were used for that purpose as well. In general, a print is the final product of a photograph. We're accustomed to thinking of them as being on paper, but they were at one time made on glass. It's the final product, and we'll talk a little bit about how and why that came about. And then finally, a slide is a thing that you use to project light through and create an image on another surface, like a wall or a screen, just like modern or sort of modern slides we use today. I guess we don't use them anymore. We use PowerPoint, but, in the 20th century, those little 35 millimeter slides, same deal, they used to make them on glass. So those are the three basic types of things one might find that look like some kind of photo on glass. So first we'll talk about the wet plate collodion process. It's often called just wet plate or just collodion. This process created negatives, and it was invented in 1851 by Frederick Scott Archer, who you see here. And he did not patent this process. He wrote it up in a journal. I think it was called The Chemist. And as a consequence, sadly, he died penniless with debts that his family was responsible for. But luckily, there was a GoFundMe in a Victorian variation, and some photographer people and friends got together and collected money for his family, so it worked out relatively okay. And anyway, Mr. Archer here invented this process because he was previously using the collodion process invented by Fox Talbot, and the details weren't good enough for his purposes. That's more of a ethereal, a little bit fuzzy look, and I believe Mr. Archer was photographing his sculptures, if I remember correctly, and he needed it to be more documentary than ethereal. So he worked on this process, and what he did was he made an entire process that is done in camera. So it's literally like a darkroom in a box. He would go in his box camera thing, bag, and take a piece of glass and coat it with collodion, which is a sticky substance that was also used at the time to dress wounds. Strangely, it is a mixture of gun cotton and ether that's mixed with potassium iodine. It sounds terrifying to me, but it was handy. And then he would sensitize this sticky glass plate using silver nitrate. And while the plate was still wet with these chemicals, he would, still inside the camera, set it up and expose it using the lens. It's only it was pretty quick exposure for this era, of only a few seconds usually. And then he'd take the plate and develop it in the box. Like, it was never exposed to light throughout the entire process, except for the few seconds of exposure to make the image. So there were other chemicals he then used to develop the image and to fix it, which means to make it permanent and non-light sensitive. Then he'd come out of his box and he would have a negative. And that negative could be used to print paper photographs like we're used to ad infinitum. And here's an example of one. Here's the negative, and here's a print made on paper from it. So the negative is glass and the print is paper. We're talking about finding these glass negatives at the moment, so paper's irrelevant, but just shows you the kind of detailed image this can create. There's a lot of tonalities and shadows and detail, and this isn't even a particularly spectacular one, but you can see the quality of this process. Pardon. So that's the wet plate collodion process. And then, about 20 years later, in the 1870s, this fellow, Dr. Richard L. Maddox, was using said wet plate collodion process, but he was making him really sick. Something to do with the gun cotton and the ether and the, yeah, he was not into it. So he was actually famous for, he did microscopic photography. He innovated in a lot of ways. But anyway, he needed to improve on the wet plate process for his work. So he actually invented the dry plate process, also known as the silver gelatin dry plate process. And it starts with what we just looked at, wet plate, and makes it better and more convenient. So his plates could be prepared ahead of time, not in the camera, and stored when they were dry, put in the camera, used, taken out, developed, and then used to make prints. So same basic idea, but he improved the chemical technology so that the plates didn't have to be wet when they were exposed. And so the outcome of these is pretty similar. So the glass is a negative and doesn't look terribly different from the wet plate negative. And the positive or print is on paper. And there you go. So if you find a glass image thing and you want to know if it is a negative, be it either a wet plate or dry plate negative, ask yourself these questions. Is it glass? Is it a negative? If so, it is a glass negative. I'm sorry, that sounds very snarky, but it's actually that easy. So if you find an image that's negative, that's a glass negative. And to tell whether it's wet plate or dry plate, it's a little trickier. You might probably rely on the subject matter a lot if it's if you can date it, by clothes or subject matter or anything else to the 1850s to 1870s, then it's most likely to be a wet plate collodion. And if it is 1870s or later, it is more likely to be dry plate. Personally, I feel like wet plates have a sort of creamier, more charcoaly feel, and dry plates are more of a straight gray tone and look more like modern film because they use a more similar chemical process. But that's very subjective. And to make it trickier, both of these technologies have been revived in the past 20, 30 years. And people are using both of these processes today. And they're artists doing amazing work. And if you're into this sort of thing, you should check it out. Like look up wet plate collodion artists because they're doing beautiful, beautiful things with these old processes. But you're unlikely to find just, a modern glass negative at your average estate sale or whatever. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. But just to be aware, people are making these still today. And let's move to the next type of thing. So the next type of thing is a collodion positive. And usually these are called ambrotypes, and I think I will just call them ambrotypes because everyone does. Just so you know, technically, ambrotype should refer only to a specific kind of collodion positive. It was patented by James Ambrose Cutting in the 1850s, and it used a specific Canada balsam seal between the plate and the glass. And anyway, so they were actually pretty common in the US. So what you might find here may well be an ambrotype, but elsewhere slightly different chemicals were used, and they're just collodion positives. Now you can forget that because it's not that important. Okay, so the collodion positive is basically the same process as the wet plate collodion we looked at, but there's another step where the negative image is reversed, sort of, by bleaching the silver salts. And the dark areas that would normally be the highlights in a printed image turn pale, and the clear areas, which would form the shadows in the print, appear dark. So they sort of look like a negative, but they're pale and they're really not quite a negative, but they kind of look like one if you just have one and hold it up to the light. But the secret is when you place them against a black background or coat the back of the glass with black, they appear positive, like this image you see here, which is only blurry because of my screen resolution issue here, not because it's blurry. It's actually very nice and crispy in real life. Okay, so with an ambrotype, the glass is actually the print. You can't make prints from these, even though they're sort of negative, because the emulsion is too thin and it's not really right to make prints from. So it is the end product. You take it as you make it in the camera, and it is the finished product. So here's one. And this is what I mean about how they are funny negatives. So if you just look at an ambrotype not with a black backing, it's going to look something like this. It kind of looks like a negative, but it's a little bit weird and it's quite pale. And here you see this half is see-through, and this part has a black card behind it or something, and it magically becomes the positive. It is magic. It is not chemistry, it is magic. So you know you have an ambrotype. Oh wait, I have a slide about that. So you know you have an ambrotype if it's glass, and it can, if it has a black backing, be it either painted on or it's sitting on a card or you place it on something black, it looks positive. But if it's not on a backing, it looks like a pale negative and a little weird. So that's how you tell if it's an ambrotype. The next kind of thing is magic lantern slides. So these are just slides. They are actually invented in the 17th century, at the way before photography, obviously. And at that time, they were just painted images on glass that were projected using candles or lamps. And as different image making technology has evolved, so have slides. So let's see. Here are some magic lantern projectors and some glass magic lantern slides. It's basically the same thing as, your average 1980s, 1950s, whatever, slide projector and slides, except these are glass. They have been made with all kinds of different technologies over the years. Like I mentioned, they're initially hand painted. They've been printed more like a offset paper printing technology in both color and black and white. They've been made using decals, like stuff's printed on a transparent substrate of some sort and applied to the glass. They've been made with what we're talking about mostly, black and white or color photography, or sometimes black and white that's hand colored. So they're developed on glass, like a photograph, but they're positives and they're meant to be projected. So here's some smaller ones that were made by Keystone, which was a very prolific maker in the from like the 1890s to the 1960s. They produced thousands of images of all kinds of stuff, people and places, in the US and around the world. You might also know they did stereo view cards, similar stuff. Then they started in an educational branch where they made slides for schools for teaching purposes, kind of like the forerunner of photo transparencies and slide strips and all that fun stuff. So you might find these, they have this commercial look to them, and they're usually labeled with what they are. I think I see more black and white, but they did also come in color later. So those you might find. And let's see. So to know if you have a slide of some sort, is it glass? Is it a positive? Is it in a slide holder or edge-only frame with or without a label? So basically, both a print, like an ambrotype, or a slide will be positive, but an ambrotype will usually be more of an artistic, well, not artistic, but a more like a portrait or a scene or something, and it will be a singular image in a frame, but it might be, separated from its frame. Whereas slides you'll usually find in bunches. They're usually in holders of some kind, like either these little metal houdinies with cardboard, or these wood ones that are older, or these kind. They usually have a border, and they often have labels and are sort of commercially produced. I guess it was possible to make your own magic lantern slides, of course, but they're still gonna have the holder and all that. And one final related tip. So if you are selling an image and it's a negative, it's really great to show the positive as well. And if you're, nerdy, no, let me recharacterize that. You may have photo editing software on your computer already, like Photoshop or any number of things. But if not, there is a free tool online at invert.imageonline.co. I'm sure there's others as well. This is very easy though, where you just upload your negative image and it will invert it into a positive image, which you can then download as a PNG or JPEG, both of which are perfectly fine to use on listing sites such as eBay, etc., etc. So, yeah, invert.imageonline.co if you need to invert an image. And this site actually also has a whole bunch of cool utilities for images. So I don't know. I have no affiliation, don't know anything about it except I Googled it up and I thought it was cool. So that's your last tip. And if you find any of these cool glass things, now maybe you'll know what they are. All right, have fun and good luck searching. Bye.